Okay. Hi everyone. Lovely to see you all. Just waiting on the last couple of people to come in from the waiting room before we get started. Thank you for your patience. Perfect. Okay, looks like you're all connected. So thank you all so much for joining us this evening. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I am currently seated, the Yagara and Turrbal people. I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. It's my absolute pleasure to be here with you all this evening for this very special discussion of Kavita Bedford's debut novel, Friends and Dark Shapes. As most of you are no doubt aware, we should have been having this event in person in the shop, and I am really sad that we couldn't do that. But of course, it is still going to be an absolutely fantastic evening. And I'm so pleased that you're all here with us from wherever you are at the moment, be it in Brisbane or elsewhere. So before I hand over to our speakers tonight, I just want to really quickly reiterate some of the information that you were sent in the email with your link to join us tonight. So as you've no doubt noticed, you are already placed on mute and you'll remain so throughout the evening, but that doesn't mean that we don't take questions. Kavita has reassured me that she is happy to take your questions. We just take them a little bit differently at Avid Reader. If you can please pop them in the chat box as you think of them, then they'll come straight through to me and I will read them out later on in the evening when prompted to do so. The chat box is usually towards the lower left of your screen. If you can't see it right now, then don't worry too much because I'm going to be using it to post the link that you can use to purchase your copies of Friends and Dark Shapes from us at Avid Reader. And when I do, you'll be able to see the chat box pop up on your screens. So lastly, we rarely have any technical issues, but if we do, and for any reason one of our speakers drops out this evening, we will just take a brief pause and readmit them as soon as possible. Same goes for all of you joining us tonight. If you happen to drop out, don't worry. Quickly click that link that you were sent in the email and you can rejoin us using that one. I will make sure that I admit you as quickly as possible so that you don't miss anything. So that's enough from me. I'd now like to introduce Kavita Bedford. Kavita is an Australian Indian writer with a background in journalism, anthropology and literature. Her writing has appeared in Guernica, The Guardian and Griffith Review, and she was a recent Churchill Fellow exploring migrant narratives. She works and teaches in Sydney in media and global studies. And in conversation with Kavita tonight, we have Laura Elvery. Laura is the multi-award-winning author of 2 short story collections, Trick of the Light and Ordinary Matter. And so, Kavita and Laura, I will now hand over to you both for tonight's discussion.
Thanks, Emma Kate. Hello, everyone. I'll acknowledge the traditional custodians here where I am, same place as Emma Kate, the Jagera and Turrbal people, and I pay my respects to their elders and to any elders here tonight. Welcome, everyone. It is really wonderful to have you all here. I'm going to talk a bit about Kavita's beautiful novel. We're going to have an in-conversation, and then there will be time at the end for audience questions. Firstly, congratulations, Kavita, on your first novel and welcome to Brisbane, sort of.
Thank you. It's good to sort of be here.
I know.
I'm not there, but thank you for the
feedback. So sorry. I do want to acknowledge how disappointing it is to not be meeting you properly and, you know, having a glass of bubbly afterwards at the restaurant next door to Avid Reader. And, you know, it's been a tough, what are we getting on to now, 13 months for authors, particularly debut authors who long to be with people and sign books and take photos. And so I just acknowledged how disappointing that might be. And but it's still really lovely, obviously, that we can do this and Zoom in with people all over the place.
And I got myself, I poured a glass of wine.
You did, good.
It feels like we are still amongst celebration and good times as well. So yes. Yeah, lovely to be here.
Can you give us a sense of what this past month has been like for you and your book to begin?
I mean, in so many ways, wonderful. We were so lucky in Sydney because lockdown got lifted just before my novel came out. So we were actually able to have an in-person launch, which was so beautiful. And I think the book is so much about disconnection and loneliness in a city. So to actually be able to be in a, solid physical space with each other felt actually really important. And it felt like it was about the novel, but it was also about other people who've been going through so much disconnection and loneliness the last year themselves. So it's sort of like this, this novel that has been in the works for about 4 years came out at a time when it sort of felt on this much more global, amplified scale as well. So,
yeah, and people who go to your events are just as excited to be there as you, aren't they?
Just to be in an event. But then a lot of it's been online sort of, spaces after that and radio and over the phone and things like that. So it's a precarious, strange space as a debut author, as you say. And, you spend 4 years sort of teaching yourself how to be a writer and a hermit and practice a daily craft. And then you sort of want this little explosion of, interaction and to actually see the faces of the people who are reading it and have those kinds of messy, strange conversations, which is, we're so lucky that with, Zoom and things, people can come in from all places and it gives access to other countries. And, I can see my aunt and uncle who are in Paris or in France there. And, it's so wonderful in that sense. But yeah, obviously nothing ever fully compares to the face-to-face.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to start with some compliments about your book. So, sit tight for just a minute while I talk about your debut novel. So Friends in Dark Shapes is your moody and heartfelt debut novel. It's set in present-day Sydney for people who haven't read it. And across the space of just over a year, in dozens of chapters, almost like vignettes, the reader comes to understand the unnamed narrator's grief, her worries about poverty and climate change and relationships, as well as her obsessions and the memories that haunt her. She is a freelance journalist who pitches stories, sends emails that sometimes go nowhere, goes out some days into Sydney suburbs to interview locals about their lives. The friends of the title include Sammy, Nikki and Bowerbird, the protagonist's 3 housemates, second-generation migrant families in a share house in Redfern. And the dark shapes, well, the narrator's beloved father has recently died and she's wading through grief about his loss and the altered and strained relationship with her mum, who's returned to India for a while. Friends in Dark Shapes is a beautiful novel about a city. We see Sydney's beauty and gloss, but also its degradation and its inhabitants with nowhere to go. It's a novel about friendship, fathers, daughters, lovers, and the memories that keep circling us. And I hope everyone here tonight buys it and reads it. So Kavita, the reader is first dropped into a section titled Spring, and then we move through the seasons in lots of chapters, some just 1 or 2 pages long, which I personally love in a book. Short chapters, no quotation marks for dialogue, and it's very fluid. So how did you hit upon these structural choices in Friends in Dark Shapes?
Yeah, I mean, some of it came out of, the novel was in a certain iteration at one stage, and I altered it, and I actually went through a process of needing to rewrite the whole novel.
I heard about this, Kavita, a big culling.
It was a big culling and it was a big purge and it was a huge rewrite and reconfiguration. And I think a huge part of that was discovering the voice of what is now Friends in Dark Shapes. And so much was, the books that I love reading, where they're often quite short form, tight, clean chapters. I quite love sparse writing that still manages to get sort of the intensity. I love poetry so much. So I think a lot of it also comes from wanting those very pared back sort of sentences and forms and structures. And it was the right structure for this kind of book and the right voice for this kind of book, where it is talking about so many things that are about silences and what is allowed to be said and what isn't allowed to be said. So I kind of wanted a very, kind of bracing, kind of simplified language to actually look at it, that was sort of cutting down on a lot of the descriptors and adjectives and, you know, sort of bringing things into a very sort of sparse form.
And one thing I think the reason why I like a lot of those books that have those short chapters is it just does feel pacier as a reader. Is that how it felt to you as a writer as well? Like I'm picturing you writing, perhaps you could do a couple of those in a day, a draft of a few of those chapters in a day. Am I right?
I can't, but I'm glad you can.
No, Kavita, I can't. I'm picturing you being able to do that.
I think that also I knew quite early on that I wanted to include so many voices of the friends, but also people and characters in Sydney, and to allow the kind of voices of other characters to come within. As you say, there's sort of no quotation marks. There's often nothing to necessarily signify there's a new character entering the space. And so I wanted that writing to be very tight as well, for pace, structure, rhythm, and to kind of bring in what I love is kind of everyday vernacular, and so much of, you know, the way people just speak day to day, I think has its own kind of poetics to it.
Absolutely.
And I really wanted to include that. And, you know, heaps of the way that sort of younger people speak at parties, and this kind of casual sort of, this, and not just vernacular, but, you know, all kinds of slang, I think is so beautiful. And I actually had this moment when I was working with one of my colleagues and another writer, and all of the writers were from America and not from Australia. And I had words in there like gurning and like a few other, and there was a bush doof as well. And, you know, I just got all these comments like, what on earth are you talking about? And the funny thing is, you know, I think bush doof is perfect. I think it's a perfect word.
Correct.
And bring together. I think gurning is beautiful, even for what it is. And I kind of love this Aussie slang and this way of pitter patter, but I wanted to very much, put that within a kind of poetic form, if you will.
Yes, pitter patter. That's a really nice way of putting it. I can see that on the page, even as I'm remembering it, but as I was reading it as well. The narrator revisits lots of sites across Sydney. So it really is a book about a city, which we'll talk a little bit about because I'm fascinated with those sorts of books. All these sites that hold certain types of memories for her, among others, those she ventured with her father, and sites where she was a teenager partying with friends. And these reveal such clear details about street life and smells and sounds, the food, scenes of aggression and violence between strangers on public transport, as well as really pretty tourist sites in Sydney that we all know. As a mapping Sydney exercise, how did the locations in each scene come to you?
Oh, this was the most fun part.
Right.
I love cities. And, you know, I think for several reasons, I never thought I'd write a book about Sydney, and I was very much compelled and drawn to places outside of Sydney. And when I was sort of found myself staying in Sydney for a long period of time, I myself took a little bit to exploring aspects of it. And one of the things that I found so interesting was how it feels often like one end of this city doesn't necessarily talk to the other end of that the city. And, you know, so much of it is geographical, and I don't think intentional. It's a really, I don't know if you've been or spent much time, but it's incredibly sprawling and it takes a long time. You know, there's just that logistics and feasibility of actually, if you wanted to go from Bankstown to Bondi, it takes quite a long space. So as a result, I think a lot of the city is become quite sort of segregated. And I found that such a fascinating idea of what does it mean to kind of occupy a city where we're not necessarily even talking across with each other. But we are a global city that houses so many people from different places. So that was one aspect, but then also I think spending time in different places, also realizing there are slightly different characteristics to each place. And it's not just an imagined kind of, you know, space. There's actually genuine historical and to do with, you know, again, the geography of who settles where. And so that kind of really fascinated me, in a city where, you know, and so many of us spend so much of our time in these other great cities. And I just wasn't necessarily reading a lot about Sydney in that holistic sense. I knew it as a city where, you know, and what most people overseas know as well is the tourist trappings, the way it is perceived. We know we're not the most loved city within Australia, you know, like it has all these stereotypes, and they exist for sure. But I guess, you know, when you inhabit a space, there's so many voices and people that just get systematically left out of that story. And I couldn't pretend that this is a book that even manages to get hardly any of those voices, but I did want to have some attempt at looking at.
It really does. I think it really does.
Thank you. Thank you. That was something that felt really important. And I think something that I really struggled with, because I sort of thought when I walk out into the streets or I go for long walks in this city, the people that I rub up against or see or that are just part of the day-to-day makeup often don't make it into stories, even as backdrop characters.
Absolutely.
So that was something that I, wanted to fulfill, but it also felt very realistic when talking or writing about a city.
Yeah, I can think of several scenes, like the one at the chemist with the customer and the person behind the counter, and these, you know, sort of racial microaggressions, and they're just not understanding each other, and nothing can sort of solve this problem between them until the narrator comes in a little bit, and it's still unsolved by the end, but we are meeting characters in each of these chapters who, you're right, we don't see on the page really. Speaking of housing, Kavita, and where all these people live, we have this share house in Redfern, and the opening chapter sets it up so well, and it's really very witty. I really enjoyed it. I let out a big laugh at the end of chapter 1, because it's stepping through what it's like to advertise for a housemate in a share house. And I was wondering if you could read a bit of the opening of Friends and Dark Shapes for us.
Oh, sure. So this is the opening chapter, and they've already managed to go through 2 different potentials, and we're on to the final and last character that they're interviewing and seeing if he's the right fit. The third guy tells us that he has just arrived from California, and this we already know. He likes Foles and the XX and anything dreamy, and wanted to move to Australia because it suited his lifestyle, but with more sun, sun, sun. This we also know. We know a lot about him before he arrives from his Facebook profile. He walks around the house talking, repeating his likes and dislikes, but telling us his story. And as he speaks, he touches everything. The kettle, the bench top. He even fingers the curtains. I mean, I'm just interested in good vibes, you know? I want to resonate with everything. His hair is tied up in a ponytail, and he wears loose cotton clothing and Birkenstocks and has thin woven bracelets along his arm. As he forcefully speaks of good energies, as though willing them into the space, he seems to grow while we 3 seem to shrink. There is no room for questions. He tells us things we never asked. He tells us his brother travelled here once before he died, and he did a fruit picking season, and he always said, go to Sydney. Go to Sydney, he'd said, and you will feel free. So I think, maybe in Sydney the ghosts won't follow me so much, you know? I figure you're a country even younger than ours, so the haunting might stop here, right? I feel a thud of recognition, but there is something about the way he says all of this, like it is some showman script, so I don't show that I agree. Everything in houses is dead, he continues. I've been to so many houses in this city, and I feel the occupants and their furniture are dead, you know? He says that music is spiraling downwards and everything feels the same. And he has travelled and done so many things in his life already at 30. But sometimes he feels so exhausted at the thought that he needs to keep going and that no one is saying anything new. Coachella is dead. Burning Man is dead. I want to feel light, he says. I want to feel I can breathe again. It suffocates me. You have so much sun. Why are you people so dead? He eventually stops and rests against a door frame and holds his hands wide, framing us all in the picture. But your kitchen table is alive. We are all silent for a beat, and Sammy looks at me, and Nikki takes charge of the conversation, giving long affirmative sounds, but I notice he doesn't offer a beer or something to drink like he did with the others. That evening, a last-minute friend of a friend tells us he's interested and he comes over for a beer. He works in a guitar shop, and he says he thinks Afghan hounds are the best dogs in the world, and we look at pictures of the hounds together, and he laughs easily. We end up picking this friend of a friend to make our new home in this city.
Oh, that's so funny. I was in a doctor's surgery reading it, and I just thought that is exactly how it would go with these odd bods. It's beautiful. And then they pick the person who likes the dogs and doesn't say the table is alive. Thanks, Kavita. There's a scene later on with Nikki, one of the people who is doing the interviewing, the other woman in the house. So there's 2 women and 2 men in the house. And there's a scene with the narrator and Nikki while they're cleaning the kitchen. Something awful has happened in the kitchen. What is it? Moths, flies.
Oh, with the lava. Yeah. They've got moths.
There we go. And I really sat up during that chapter because the narrator is very forceful and animated and opinionated, very active in that chapter, I thought. But in other flashbacks, in other scenes, she goes along with what her friend suggests, and things really happen to her, and she's a bit more passive in other parts of the book. Can you talk about how you built this protagonist who doesn't have a name, the process you went through, what drew you to her?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to write about, and you picked up one of the words earlier, like I guess I wanted to write a lot about microaggressions, and I wanted to write about being in such a big city where, you know, everyone has lost something, and it's on different scales and it's in different ways, but everyone is going through something in a city that is large. But there's so much inability to speak or disconnection around that. And it often feels like it's easier, you know, you put your head down and it's just easier to get on with it. And I guess I wanted the narrator in a way to kind of represent a bit of the silences that we all have. So despite the fact that she's grieving, so that silence is very much bound up in grief, and grief not being something that we can speak about openly, which was another big topic that I wanted to talk about. But I also really wanted her to stand in a little bit for the silences and the ways we're all a little bit passive in these kind of scenarios. And that was so much of, you know, and I was reading, I actually wasn't at the beginning of this book, but I was reading kind of when I was halfway through this book, writing it. I was reading quite a lot of Rachel Cusk. And one of the things that I love that Rachel Cusk does is, you know, also as a female in public spaces, there's this feeling of people always talking at you, and a kind of misunderstanding of what a woman is even necessarily doing in a public space, where people feel that they are allowed to sort of reveal their entire lives and their stories. And there's something very beautiful in that, but there's also something which is very charged, and it's a power dynamic. And I, you know, in the first version of the book, I was trying to write a kind of flaneur novel about walks through the city and, you know, this sort of beautiful romantic vision. Yep. And one of the things that just kept coming up, though, was like, you can't get very far without being someone interjecting into your space. You don't get to be the romance male flaneur. You don't get to be Theroux or, you know, any of these characters. No. And one of the things I loved about Rachel Cusk is her narrator is completely silent. And this not so much, but I liked that idea of people just filling silences and telling their stories and characters just coming, but the narrator themselves, where it's ambiguous exactly what their silence is about. Is it about yes, partly in this case, the grief, partly in this case, being a woman in a space, and partly also just the idea of being in a big city where you don't necessarily know how to always be charged up about everything when everyone is asking you to care about something all the time.
Mm. And she really does grow throughout the year. We're with her for sort of just over a year. And when I was reading it, it sort of came to me that it's sort of a coming of age novel, even though she's not 16-year-old Holden Caulfield and she's not 23-year-old Pip. Rather, her and her mates are on the sort of real tail end of their 20s into their early 30s. And I would argue they're sort of approaching this next decade with not a lot of optimism, but fear and trepidation about a whole host of things, some acceptance of these immovable obstacles they have in their lives. Did the genre expectations of a coming of age novel come into it for you at all? And did they help? Or is that something that, you know, people read into things that you're not conscious of at the time?
Coming of age novels are my favorite novels.
Right. Sounds like it came into it for you.
I adore them so much. I think I love coming of age novels and novels of cities. So, you know, and it was actually quite intentional, and in and in so many ways, I think one of the things that really fascinated me, or fascinates me still, but especially, you know, when I was talking with a lot of friends and peers and people at that age as well, was the benchmarks have changed. You know, the ideas of what actually constitutes an adult or a mature life, or they've completely moved around us, those goalposts. So, you know, things that were marriage, long-term careers, promotions, housing, either through choice have been done away with, or through lack of choice. And so much around, you know, impermanency within workplaces and within relationships and within housing, and this precariousness with which young people are living in. And I think I also wanted to write about, you know, without it getting into any kind of generational wars, because I think that stuff is really passé and pretty boring. But, you know, I do think one thing around the younger generation, or, you know, sort of millennials, is there's a lot of talk about, you know, all the entitlement, and I wanted to write about that entitlement as well, but that's mixed with some of the most precarious situations around employment, and, you know, like can go into all sorts of things. But I wanted to look at class and, you know, the fact that unions are done away with, the fact that all of these kinds of spaces and things that have been set up to actually to give stability, there's very little stability. And I was interested in what actually constitutes an adult, you know. And if we have now a whole generation of young people who can't get those landmarks or those goalposts or whatever it is, then what is coming of age exactly?
And Declan Fry wrote a beautiful review of Friends and Dark Shapes for The Guardian, and he, just touching on that point about, you know, precarious living, he sort of reframed that quote from Train Spotting, which is, I don't know how many years, 30? I'm sure.
A while back, yeah.
And it's get a house, get a car, as though these are sort of these, you know, mundane, boring things that these wild characters ought to do. But with your novel, it's how do they get a house? How do they get a car? In what universe are the characters in your book even considering that as a possibility, as these houses around them in Redfern are, you know, renovated, sold, flipped, all of those sorts of things?
Yeah.
I thought that was a really good point in his review.
Totally. And, you know, I was reading, you know, back in the day, like I loved Helen Garner's Monkey Group, for example. And, you know, it's also set in a share house, Melbourne, you know, and the issues, you know, 33, I think the protagonist was, or at the time, the semi-autobiographical. And, you know, all these issues that she's grappling with, which are very different. You know, you've got the commune living of the 1970s. And, but I was really interested in what happens now in a share house, and what happens now when we're talking around that kind of late 20s, early 30s stage. When you were talking about coming of age books, one of my favorite books, Australian books, was Looking for Alibrandi.
Yes.
And, you know, loved it. And
set in glebe, it's
set in
explicit.
glebe, all around these parts and stuff. But again, the issues from that stage, you know, of growing up to now are so vastly different. And I really wanted to, I was trying to find novels about that myself. And then also found myself, you know, then through, I think a lot are actually coming out now, which is really exciting.
And also kind of writing what you wanted to read as well, which is just advice always, isn't it?
Always, yeah.
You've mentioned, Kavita, a few authors tonight, and in other interviews you've mentioned the influence of some North American and British writers, including Brian Washington, Elizabeth Strout, Jenny Offal, Rachel Cusk. Can you think about, for the writers who are here tonight who love this sort of craft talk, like I love a craft talk, can you name a specific thing one of these writers has done that you admire, and how you sort of rhymed with it in your work, or reflected it in your work, or learnt something from them?
Oh, so much. I'd almost have to go through each one. I think with Jenny Offal, for example, Department of Speculation was like a bit of a Bible for me. And it's been just unbelievably thrilling to even see her now actually, you know.
Book.
Yeah, like that was, I screamed. I ran around the house and I screamed when that happened.
That's what we would do.
But one of the things that I think she really forced me to do was pay attention to the sentence. That each sentence matters. And that kind of, because they're such short form, and she's so funny. Like she's so dry and she's so funny. And there's almost a kind of funniness that you can blink and miss it, if that makes sense. Like it's just so pared back. And as I was reading her, especially Department of Speculation, whether I read later, but that way of just building sentence, and it's like a stacking, one on top of the other, that was hugely pivotal for me, and actually was a huge part of why I wanted to rewrite my book. Once I saw that, I thought I didn't want filler sentences. I didn't want sentences.
First draft. You've got,
I didn't want sentences that just were there because they, you know, and sometimes they have to happen, but I didn't want sentences that were just about getting me to a spot. I wanted to think every single way how I was getting to that spot. And I realized in my first early drafts, there was just so much, and there has to be, but there was so much in there that was just like chunks of words that were just thoughtless. Once I started looking at things with that kind of lens. So her work was really important in that sense. And also the humor. Like I love that kind of, very droll, kept back, and the way it's done. I think Rachel Cusp have talked about a bit. Elizabeth Strout, amazing for chapters. Like the way she can build in a very short space of time. And she deals with so many characters as well. And she's very great at the relationships. She deals a lot, especially with mother-daughter relationships, in a really beautiful way. But the way that she, in such short stories, again, when you actually break down, like I'd sit there and I'd actually write out the structure of all of these books.
Wow.
Because the way that she gets you to understand so much backstory without, again, having to go through the excess of writing it all out is incredible. And that's, you know, these are these artistry sort of things that are so wonderful once you become honed and see what they look like. That it's almost like this palpitation, like this huge desire to want to attempt it.
I think it's really brave of you, the way you spoke about, you know, a first draft is a lot of filler, a lot of dead ends. The way you spoke about, you know, a chunk of words, I think you said that some of them just felt really thoughtless. And I think it's very brave to acknowledge that, and also to actually purge it and to start again. And that is not easy. That's not easy to do.
Like for the writers who are here, it's awful. The amount of tears and
but the book is different, and the book is, you would say, I assume you would say it's better, and it is what it is because you made these big choices at the start to shed some words.
Totally. And, I think that's the really interesting thing, which I'm going to have to keep remembering, I think, as I continue to write, was there was a part of me in that first draft. And when I say first draft, I'd done about 60 revisions of it. It was hardly a
61st draft, the old 61st draft.
Yeah. So when I had that, I think there was just this massive desire. I remember giving it to a friend that I trusted. And I remember feeling like when I gave it to her, it was almost like I just needed her to read it and tell me that it was okay and it would work. And then I could just offload it. And I was like, I just want to give it away to someone else. I just don't want to deal with it anymore. And then the response I got from this very wonderful trusted friend was, it's not ready. And you know that.
That's a good friend.
I hated her for a moment. And it was the best friend, and it was the only person that could have said that, because she's also new going through that. But I think being, and then giving it time to rest for a while as well. And when I look back on what that was, I'm so thrilled that's not out in the world.
Wow.
I'm so happy that I didn't just get lazy.
That's lovely. Thank you, Kavita, for being so honest about that. In your final version that we have, we get these lovely scenes about father and daughter going out for dinner and being on the train together. So, really quite mundane life occurrences. The narrator says of grief, which is going to be, when you hear it, the most perfect description of grief. It doesn't obey a linear arc. It ducks and weaves. It dwells in the past. Not only is this an exquisite description of loss, I think, but it's almost a pattern that I think you might have been following when you wrote the novel. Not a linear arc, ducks and weaves, dwells in the past. So can you just talk a little bit about the flashbacks and the way the narrator gives the reader lots of painful memories, but also really joyful memories as well?
Yeah, I mean, I really wanted the book to, as much as possible, tap into the emotion of grief. And like you say, I structured it around grief and exactly that. And I remember I kept writing prefaces. Like I had all these, I wrote hundreds of prefaces to this book because I kept feeling like I needed to point out to people at one point that I'm doing what grief does. That's why it's not necessarily going to places. And I also then let go of that, because it also became really important to look at, how does a novel or a piece of work follow these kinds of, that space where it's very limbo and very liminal, and time doesn't obey, and you find it very hard to work out what is present, past, future. And the idea of a future is not even particularly interesting. And at the same time, though, it became very abundantly clear that while you can have these, a novel can't just be in that one space. And it really needed and required the kind of youthful energy, which is why these kind of I wrote so many party scenes, and so many kind of dialogue heavy scenes to try to punctuate through that. And I think the thing with grief as well is, it does come in ebbs and flows, and so much of the past, so much of what we grieve is because we're also thinking about it. We're thinking about the past, but we're thinking about when something of what's happening now, suddenly that flashback becomes so much harder. And that happens to people as well all the time.
And impermanence as well, which is a really great theme of the novel. A lot of these, there's a man about to be a dad. There's a man whose sister might be dying. All these houses are being sold around them. Nothing is permanent, which sort of reflects a bit of that, of the narrator's thought process as well, I think.
Yeah, precisely.
I'd like to pause here for a sec, if you wouldn't mind, and we'll have questions from the audience. I know we have some in maybe 5 or 10 minutes, but if you wouldn't mind reading from one of my favourite chapters, Kavita, chapter 42. We're getting towards the end. We're about to loop back to spring here. Would you mind reading for us all again?
Yeah, of course. Sorry, which chapter?
Let's go with 42. I think it's really beautiful with the father and the daughter.
Yeah. Sorry, one moment. My computer's just being really strange. You're still able to hear me, yeah?
Yes, we're here.
It disappeared for me. So
No.
as long as you're all still there. 42. One-on-one time, he called it. He told me constantly as I was growing up how important it is. He set up times with me, even when I was younger and we lived in the same house, and these were unbreakable dates. When I was older, he took me out to dinner at restaurants, with candles on the table, a bottle of red wine tucked under his arm. He had been a bachelor until his 40s, and he still maintained the habit of eating out. Domesticity felt clumsy in his hands, which my mother made up for with her rich curries. His repertoire included boiled rice, boiled eggs, boiled vegetables, and then, plucked obscurely from his travels, Imam Bayeldi, the Turkish emperor's eggplant dish. When I reached my 20s, something shifted. We would go out and the waiters would stare. The staff would cautiously ask if he and his miss would like the chef's special, or allude to romance in a way that made us both inwardly cringe. We didn't look alike, and people couldn't place the older white man with his young, browner daughter. So he often dropped in the comment early that he was taking his daughter out, or made some passing remark about his daughter's accomplishment in finishing university, and I would feel strange and embarrassed for him and for myself, and it threatened something imprecise that we had built up together. Fathers and daughters are in a delicate world that is not built strong enough to withstand questions. Over these dinners, he told me about the Italian poet he loved, Pavese, and the time he visited the poet's city of Turin, and how Pavese was arrested for not joining the fascist army, and just how much he admired this man and his words. My father told me we read history and we read poetry, sometimes for the same reasons. It helps us look at what we have come out of and what we are heading towards. He said it can help us with the big questions: what it is to love, what we have destroyed, and how to deal with loss. Only now have these dinners started to feel like rare, magical acts.
That's lovely. Thanks, Kavita. Did either of it is such a beautiful father-daughter novel. While you were writing it, did either of the relationships shrink or grow in a way that was unexpected for you?
In terms of the relationship between the father-daughter, or just overall?
As you were writing it, did he start to, quote unquote, intrude on the story more or less, or did you you've got lots of friendship scenes as well? How did you write that beautiful relationship, and how did it change over the course of the 4 years you said it took to write?
I think one part that was quite intentional was that I wanted the father to still remain as almost like a bit of a symbolic or almost mythical representation of the city. So I wanted him and the city to kind of merge as one, as the past. And, as she's sort of growing up in this city that is his city. So it was more about where to place, to choose quite few chapters, actually.
Yep.
Writing quite sparingly about him, but choosing which moments and why, and then where to place them in that narrative arc. And that was something that took a lot of thinking about how I was going to bring him into it.
And because the city changed, like he's talking about, when I came here earlier, it was like this, and now I'm showing it to you. So we see how it's changed even for him, and then it's changed for her as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I very much wanted this idea of the city is always changing, and how do we deal with things that are literally being shuffled and reshaped and moved before our eyes. And, you always hear older people talk about, this used to be there and that was there. And I remember when this was this, and no, we're not going here because that was this. And you sort of, I think for a long time, feel you're kind of immune to that. And that as it says in the book, like the city was ours, we stretched it through the nights. and this moment that happens when things start actually changing and moving before your eyes as well, I think is quite a devastating, also beautiful. It's very life force and very realistic to what life is. But it is still this moment. And yeah, I very much wanted his city of the past to be mixing with this time that the narrator is actually witnessing for the first time in this sort of coming of age.
And sort of longing for things that have changed.
Yeah. And wanting things to go back.
Thank you, Kavita. Emma Kate, I might ask you, I know there are some questions from
We've had
audience.
we've had a few questions come through. So start with one from Bianca, who says that she's loving this event. She says, were characters or situations drawn from your own experience, Kavita? If so, did you aim to capture a sort of nostalgia about living in a share house? It really does feel so relatable. And were there any parts that you found challenging to write?
Yeah, to all of these. It definitely built up of so many aspects. I mean, there's no, in terms of friends and the characters around the friends, there was no one character that actually really exists in my life. It was very much amalgamations of people, though, that I know, and conversations that have happened, and friends of friends of friends. So it's very much to get that kind of the vernacular and the language of it. Absolutely. And drawing so much on my own thoughts about this city, and not feeling particularly connected with this city as well for a very long time. And it still feels, to be honest, like it's a bit of a both way kind of situation. So very much drawing on those sorts of contemplations. And then, sorry, what was the last bit? It was
were there challenging parts, I think, was the last bit.
Yeah, I mean, I did for a long time find it very challenging. You know, the parts that became joyful for me to write were the parts that were about the share house. The share house was actually the part I wrote last, funnily enough. It's what the whole sort of book and the whole, structure of it actually hangs on. But it was the very last thing, and it was the kind of joyful part that gave it life. And that was when I started to feel like it was coming together, because until then I actually had a lot of, and way more than this, but a lot of very heavy writing about grief, and which are arguably the harder parts to write. But the kind of lighter touches came in towards the end, and that was, I think, through a personal understanding and growth of understanding that it's really important whenever we're writing about dark things that there has to be light in it, because that's life. And to just write about something with only one tone of dark heaviness almost felt voyeuristic, or a bit not abusive, but a bit kind of usury almost, and not realistic. And so the share house sort of space and time, once that clicked in, that could be the kind of vehicle to talk about these other things. And yeah, with a lot of nostalgia, again, coming of age books, I think, are so steeped in nostalgia. Like it's, I think it's such an amazing emotional sort of rendering and space to try to capture. But I wanted to also have it as, like there are those fights and those petty moments and all of those kinds of irritations, and why when we're trying to forge families and grow up, we're all sort of, we were just talking right before everyone came on about looking for houses. Like it's a constant search. And I think it's almost what I talk about more than anything with friends and people. And I sort of had this moment, and I was talking with another friend and was like, why can't we just write a book a bit about what it's like to find a house for a year? Because then you move on again, right?
Thank you. So we've had a couple of questions from people who are asking about your experience working with a publisher as a debut author. So I wondered if you could chat a bit about that. And somebody has also said, how was your experience of being edited for the first time in that way?
Yeah, always so interesting. So in terms of editing, because I was a little bit more specific, I mean, the general thing is, as a debut writer, I think it's a bizarre headspace. It's so wonderful. You know, you spend so much of your time hoping and dreaming for these kind of moments, you know, to be published. I know for me personally, I went through a space of not even thinking that far, just thinking, I want to know what it feels like to finish a project. For me, that was huge. I feel like I personally have left so many things undone or not seen things through right till the end. And it felt like a really big undertaking and something that I just wanted to know for myself if I could even do. And I think any of you who are writers, you realize it's such a psychological sort of space. It's like, you know, it's any kind of marathon or meditation practice or anything you take on each day is so different, and you have to be so patient with yourself. And it's rubbing up against so many aspects of ego and desire and what you actually want for and yearn for in the world. And it's really hard keeping all these complex thoughts in your head, and then just, you know, at the end of the day, sometimes finding you've only written one sentence. Like, it's exhausting in that way. But I think to understand and get clear about what it is you're doing for yourself first, it feels really important, because I am so thrilled, and I am, you know, the other next desire is to have it published, and then it's to have it shared with the world, and to be able to be fortunate enough to, you know, have people asking questions and care about characters and thoughts and talking with you is most beautiful reciprocal kind of relationship. And that's, I think, also what most people who are creative desire and yearn for.
So, Kavita, did you pitch it to text publishing? Did you enter an unpublished manuscript prize for this one?
No, so what I did was I had a short story published in a really amazing publication called Guernica, which is an American publication, which all, you know, desiring to be writers, I really recommend submitting stuff to them, because they're a publication that agents look at. And they're a publication that is known for producing quality, but for voices that haven't been heard before. So as a result, American agents, I already knew I wanted to pitch it to America, actually. I didn't go down Australia to begin with. I went through America, and there was a variety of reasons for that. One was because the writing about Sydney, funnily enough, had a lot of traction in America.
I bet it does.
Yeah, and I was getting feedback from writing groups and from people more there than I was getting from here, to be honest. You know, and not to make it any kind of comparative sob story, but I was getting much more rejections from Australia than America.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
And it's coming out in America as well, sorry?
So, yes, so I got an American agent, and I got an American deal first, which is so it's a bit of an unusual way. I got it with Europa. And then Australia is actually my foreign rights deal. So, which is bizarre. Yeah, so it's quite unusual. It was a bit of a different path. But Australia published it first. So I got to work with, and what was really interesting was I got to work with an American editor and an Australian editor at the same time on the book.
Wow.
Yeah, which was really interesting.
One got bushed off for a tick, and one got a cross.
Yeah, actually, America was like all about keeping those language. They were like, we love it. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. What a great story, Kavita.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think we've got time for one more, and I'm going to read this lovely comment as well as a question from Nicole, who says, "Hi Kavita, I loved your book. I flew through it and immediately wished I was a slower reader because I didn't want it to end. Your writing is so fresh and clean and precise. Every word is intentional, and it was very enjoyable to read. I can't get enough of it. So I'm wondering, what's next for you? Do you have another book in the works?"
Thank you, Nicole. That's beautiful. The question after is less beautiful. No one wants to be answering that question. But yeah, I'm working on stuff. I've got some short stories that I'm hoping will be coming out sort of fairly soon. which was a really nice break to do actually after working on something so long form and on a hard topic as well. I think there's a part of me that just wants to flex muscles in some other areas and actually work out other voices as well. So it feels like short stories and kind of short essays at the moment are what I'm feeling kind of gravitating towards. But then I am hoping to pick up again. I've got some ideas for the next stuff and the next things I want to work on, but just working out what form. I've actually become a little bit obsessed now with short chapters and vignettes, which I don't know if that's wonderful or if that's problematic, but the thought of almost writing a whole novel with all the parts in it feels somewhat a bit hard, or something I'm feeling a bit of aversion to at the moment. So we'll see what happens with that. But yeah, I'm hoping that you'll see some short stories coming out fairly soon.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Well, I'm sure that I'm not alone in saying that I can't wait to see those coming out. Kavita and Laura, thank you so much for this beautiful conversation tonight. As we talked about earlier, I'm really sorry that we couldn't be having it in person. However, when those short stories come out, please come up and see us in person in Brisbane, and we'll definitely be doing this again, and we'll live stream it so that everybody who's joining us from outside of Brisbane can still be a part of it too.
That would be wonderful. That's incentive to write right there.
So yeah, unless either of you have any final comments, then I'd just like to remind the audience that I have posted the link that you can use to purchase your copies of Friends in Dark Shapes from us at Avid Reader. And thank you all for joining, and thank you for your wonderful questions tonight.
Thank you so much. And thanks to Avid Reader and to Laura as well. Like, it's it's so pleasurable to be doing this with you guys. So thank you.
You're so welcome. It's an honor. Thanks, Kavita. Congratulations on your book.
Thank you. And thanks for everyone for joining online instead of in the bookstore.
I can see a couple of people holding their copies up as well. Thank you both. Have a lovely night, everybody.
Thank you.
Good night.